The truck was dark. Calvin Reese sat in the passenger seat of the idling Kenworth, with the yard lights throwing orange bars through the window glass, and his phone in his hand and his thumb already on the name. Not a name most people in this building knew. Not a name he had given anyone here. He looked at the man in the driver's seat, head tilted, eyes closed, breath coming slow and even. And he looked at the phone, and he made the call. He did not lower his voice. That was the first thing the lawyers would ask about later, and his answer was the same every time. No, he did not lower his voice. He had no reason to. Some people lower their voices in the presence of power. Some people have decided what they owe a room before they walk into it, and they pay that debt before they've checked whether the room is even asking. Calvin Reese had never been that kind of person. The army had tried to make him that kind, and it had failed, and he had come out the other end with an understanding of hierarchy that was both complete and entirely pragmatic. Roz had been at the overnight desk for 11 years, which was 7 more than Calvin, and she had developed in that time the particular economy of a person who has learned what matters on a long shift and discards the rest. She was 53, had 3 grandchildren whose photographs were arranged in a specific order on the desk that Calvin had understood was not random without asking, and she managed the overnight board with a precision that the day shift managers acknowledged grudgingly and never credited publicly. She had figured out something about Calvin in his first 3 months. She had not said it directly. Roz communicated sideways, through suggestion and implication and the strategic placement of information, but she had said, one night when they were both running a snarled board and the coffee was cold and 2 drivers had gone to ground on the same route, "You know what your problem is, Reese. You're running this like a deployment. All resource management, no margin for what you don't know." He had looked at her. "What am I missing?" "Not missing," she said. "You're not missing anything. You just think the board is the whole operation, isn't it?" She had given him a look that contained approximately 11 years of information. The board is what's visible. The operation is also everything the board doesn't show. He had thought about this for a long time. He thought about it in terms of his own operation, the one Roz didn't know about, and he thought about what Meridian's board didn't show, and he wrote down the specific gaps in a document on his personal device that became, over the following 8 months, the basis for the negotiating position Desmond was currently deploying. He had not told Roz about RW Freight. She was not owed that information, but she was the reason he had understood how to use what he knew. Calvin Reese had worked the overnight dispatch desk at Meridian Freight Solutions for 4 years and 7 months. He had come to Meridian the way most people came to jobs like his, sideways, through a gap in something else. He had done 8 years in Army logistics, 2 deployments, supply chain management for a forward operating base in conditions that would have dissolved most civilian operations. He had moved tonnage in places where moving tonnage incorrectly cost people their lives, and he had moved it correctly, and when he came home he had a daughter who was then 3 years old and a marriage that had not survived the second deployment in any meaningful way. Dina had stayed through the reintegration and through the first year back, and then one Thursday she had told him, with the particular care of someone who has rehearsed the conversation, that she felt like she had been waiting for him to come home, and he had come home but she didn't know the man who had walked in the door. He understood what she meant. He did not fight it. He took the job at Meridian because the night hours worked with the custody arrangement, and because logistics was what he knew, and because the yard at 2 in the morning was as close to quiet as this city got. His daughter Imani was 11 now. She spent weekdays with Dina and weekends with Calvin, and she had her father's stillness and her mother's sharpness and her own specific habit of asking the one question nobody in the room had been willing to ask. Her 5th grade teacher had told Calvin at the last conference that Imani was the kind of student who made the other students think harder. He had not been surprised. He brought her to the yard sometimes on Saturday afternoons when the day shift was light and Roz was on, and there was no reason she couldn't sit at the secondary desk and do her homework while he finished paperwork. She liked the yard. She liked the scale of the trucks and the logic of the manifests and the radio chatter, which she had learned to decode. She had asked him once when she was 8 why there were green trucks in rows 3 and 7 that weren't the same as the other trucks. He had told her they were his. She had looked at them for a long time. Then she had said, "All of them?" "All of them," he had said. She had nodded, with the gravity of someone filing important information, and gone back to her homework, and not mentioned it again until she was 9, and she had come back from a social studies unit on business ownership and asked whether his trucks had a name. He had told her they did. RW Freight. She had asked what the letters stood for. He had told her. She had said she wanted to choose the font for the door lettering, and he had said yes, and she had spent a Saturday going through typography samples with the seriousness of a senior designer, and the font she chose was the one on the doors of all 12 trucks currently sitting in rows 3 and 7 of the Meridian yard. His mother's name was on each one. He had brought Imani to the yard on the second Saturday of October, when the weather was still decent and the day shift was light, and she had a history project due Monday that she claimed she could do while sitting at the secondary desk. She set up her laptop and her notes and worked for an hour while he ran end-of-week paperwork. And then she got up and walked to the window that overlooked the staging area and stood there looking at the trucks. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, do the drivers know they're driving your trucks?" He thought about how to answer this. "They know they're driving RW trucks. Some of them know I own RW. Do the people here know? Your boss?" "I'm going to handle that," he said. She turned from the window. She had her mother's way of looking at him when she was deciding whether to press a point, which was that she didn't look away. When the time is right. She turned back to the window. She was quiet for a moment. "The font looks good on the doors," she said. "It does." "Grandma's name looks good on the doors." "It does," he said again, more quietly. She went back to her history project. He went back to his paperwork. The trucks sat in their rows in the October light, and the font Imani had chosen at 9 years old held the name of a woman who had believed in something before it was believable, which was what made it worth putting on the doors of 12 trucks, and also what made it worth protecting. What Calvin did not tell his employer, or his colleagues, or anyone at Meridian, was that he owned RW Freight. RW stood for Reese Washington, Washington being his mother's name, and the name of the operation's founding capital, which was her small inheritance from a great-uncle in Savannah, which Calvin had taken 11 years ago, with her blessing and her insistence, and built into 12 trucks and 4 regional contracts, and an operational footprint that had, in the preceding 6 months, become interesting to larger freight players. One of those larger players was Meridian. He had not meant to work at Meridian while Meridian was trying to acquire the thing he owned. It had started as research, the kind of ground-level operational intelligence you could not get from a consultant's report or a due diligence summary. The kind you got by working the board at 2 in the morning and seeing where the gaps were, which routes ran thin, which drivers the company depended on, and how thinly, what the actual utilization rate was across the fleet. His lawyer Desmond had found this information useful in ways that the acquisition team at Meridian would have found uncomfortable if they had known the source. He had not been asked the right question. His employment file said he owned an LLC. Nobody at Meridian had thought to look at what the LC did. Nobody, possibly except Gary Stiller. His mother called on Thursdays. This had been true since the divorce, which she had not commented on and had never asked him to explain, but which had resulted in a standing Thursday call that contained, in the years since, the full record of 2 people who loved each other and did not need to perform it. Clara Reese was 67 and lived in the house where Calvin had grown up in southeast Columbus, which she maintained with the same systematic attention she had brought to everything else in her life. She had been a bookkeeper for 31 years. She had a gift for numerical pattern that Calvin had inherited, and Imani appeared to have doubled. She had given Calvin the inheritance from her great-uncle, not reluctantly, but with the specific instruction that he was to use it to build something that did not depend on anyone else's goodwill to continue existing. The negotiation, she had said on the Thursday 2 weeks before the night in the truck. "Where does it stand?" "They came back at 4.2, Calvin said. "That's lower than the first offer." "It's higher. Their first offer was 3.8. 4.2 is not what RW will be worth," Clara said. "No, then why are we still talking to them?" He had been thinking about how to answer this. The true answer was complicated. He was still talking to Meridian because the conversation itself was useful, because it was telling him things about Meridian's priorities and operational anxieties that were worth knowing regardless of whether a deal happened, because Desmond had told him 6 months ago that negotiating with a larger company was the best education in your own company's value that money couldn't buy, because his mother's name was on 12 trucks, and he intended, before anything else, to know exactly what those trucks were worth. "Because the conversation is worth having," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. She had the same quality Imani had, the patience to wait for the full sentence. Calvin, I know what I'm doing, Mama. I know you do. I'm asking if you know why. He had thought about that through 3 overnight shifts. He thought about it on the night he climbed into the passenger seat of Gary Stiller's truck. Gary Stiller was the CEO of Meridian Freight Solutions, a title he had held for 9 years and wore the way some men wore expensive watches, constantly, and in a way that wanted to be noticed. He was 61, had been in freight since his late 20s, had grown Meridian from a regional carrier to a company with 30 million in annual revenue, and had the particular habits of a man who had built something real and was now primarily afraid of watching it diminish. He managed through presence, unexpected visits to the overnight shift, walkthroughs of the dispatch floor at hours when the floor was supposed to be running on its own, a habit of showing up when people thought he wasn't there. His assistant Petra had worked for him 7 years and had, in that time, developed the specific competence of a person who manages someone else's patterns without endorsing them. She knew, for instance, that Gary arrived at final decisions through a process that resembled impasse. He would appear to be stuck. And then one morning he would come in with a position fully formed, and the position was usually right, and asking him how he had arrived at it produced answers that were technically accurate, but left out the night he had spent pacing, or the 3 conversations he had with himself in the Kenworth at 2 in the morning. She had stopped asking. She had also, over 7 years, developed a useful understanding of what Gary Stiller's presence in the yard at midnight meant. It meant he was worried about something he did not know how to name. Gary Stiller could build a business and manage a fleet and read a balance sheet with the attention of a man who had built every line of it himself. He was not good at naming what he was worried about. He was good at sitting near the thing that worried him until the thing clarified. What was worrying him, Petra suspected from the acquisition documents she handled, was RW Freight. Specifically, RW Freight's consistent refusal to move on the management clause, which meant that the person running RW was either irrational or was holding something back. And Gary Stiller's experience told him it was the latter. He had been to the yard at 2 in the morning, Petra suspected, because whoever was running RW had access to this yard. Because RW's trucks were subletting space here. Because you learned things about a company from the people who worked in proximity to it, and Gary Stiller had decided to learn them in person. He was not wrong about any of this. He was wrong about almost everything else. His assistant, a capable woman named Petra, who had worked for him 7 years and had learned to accommodate his patterns without endorsing them, had once told a colleague that Gary Stiller believed information was power and surprise was leverage, and that he treated both as capital to be accumulated and deployed. Petra did not say this critically. She said it the way you describe a weather pattern, accurately and without expectation that it would change. Desmond had called at 4:30 that afternoon, during the gap between Imani going back to Dina's and Calvin leaving for the overnight shift. They came back at 4:02, Desmond said. No movement on the management clause. They want operational control within 18 months. Calvin was in his kitchen making food he would eat at 10 p.m., halfway through his shift. That's not a counter. That's the same offer with a different number. The number is different by $200,000. Desmond, I know. A pause. Calvin, these people think they're being patient. They've been at this negotiation for 3 months. What Gary Stiller does not understand is that patience is only leverage if the other person can't wait longer. Another pause, shorter. Can you wait longer? Calvin thought about the 2 new contract inquiries that had come through RW's website in the preceding week, one from a regional grocery chain, one from a pharmaceutical distributor looking for cold chain capacity. Neither was closed. Both were serious. Yes, he said. Then I go back with the counter we discussed. Go back with the counter. He had eaten and put on the uniform. He did not think of it as a uniform, but it was, in the way all workwear is a uniform, and driven to the yard. He had done his first board run and his first yard walk, and returned to the desk and said nothing to Roz about any of it, because there was nothing yet to say. Then at 12:47 he had looked out the dispatch window and seen the Kenworth T680 park in the row beside the staging area, and he had felt the particular stillness that arrived in him when a pattern completed itself. He had moved carefully in the weeks after. He did not change his routines or alter his behavior at the dispatch desk. He continued the yard walks at their standard times, and he continued the board work, and he continued the conversations with Roz about operational patterns, and he did not do the thing that a less patient person might have done, which was to address the situation before understanding it fully. What he was doing, in the army vocabulary that had never fully left his thinking, was intelligence gathering. You did not act on incomplete intelligence. You gathered until the picture was complete enough that the action was obvious. By the 28th night of observation, the picture was complete enough. Calvin had become aware of the surveillance pattern 32 days before the night in the truck. He had been in the yard at 12:45, doing his standard perimeter walk, when he noticed the Kenworth T680 parked in the southeast corner with the engine idling and no manifest tag on the dash. He had noted the plate. He had run it through the yard management system the following morning and found that it was registered to Gary Stiller personally, not a company vehicle, a personal one. He noted the time and the location in a document he kept on his personal device, not the Meridian system. It had not been difficult to track. Gary Stiller was a man who believed he was being subtle and had never had a subordinate willing to tell him otherwise. The truck was the same truck each time, personal plates on a vehicle that was too expensive to be unremarkable, parked in positions that were adjacent to but not directly surveilling anything specific, which was itself information, because it meant Gary had not yet figured out exactly what he was looking for. Calvin had a theory about what Gary was looking for, and the theory was connected to a conversation he had overheard 6 weeks earlier between two members of the Meridian acquisitions team who had been talking in the hallway outside the supply room at 11:40 p.m. on a night when they had not known he was 10 feet away on the other side of a partially open door. The conversation had been about RW Freight. The specific content of the conversation had been, "I don't understand why they're holding at the counter. There's something we don't know about this company. Somebody find out who's actually running it." Calvin had noted this in the same document. He had also, in the weeks following, noted a series of small disruptions to his overnight routine. A temporary keycard access issue that had required him to go through the security desk to access the server room, logging his presence. A request from HR for an updated personal information form that included, newly, a field for business ownership. A shift in the overnight cameras that added a new angle on the dispatch desk. None of these was unusual on its own. In sequence, they told a story about a man trying to locate something without asking directly. Calvin had concluded that Gary Stiller did not know what he was looking for, which was a different problem from not finding it. He said nothing. The next week, the same truck appeared on a Tuesday at 1 in the morning, parked in the row nearest the secondary fence line, engine off this time, no lights. Calvin noted the time and location and went back to the board. The week after that, a Thursday, the truck was in the row beside the staging area, engine running, just after 2 a.m. Calvin finished his current board, told Roz he was going to do a yard walk, and walked the perimeter slowly, taking 40 minutes, ending at the Kenworth. He stood at the passenger door for a moment. The yard was quiet around him. He could hear the distant road noise from the highway on the far side of the fence, and the low hum of the refrigeration units on the reefer trailers parked in the south lot, and nothing else. He thought about what he was about to do, which was not reckless, but was deliberate, which were different things. Reckless was getting in the cab without having thought through what might happen next. Deliberate was getting in because he had thought through what might happen next, and decided that the alternatives were worse. The alternatives were, say nothing, continue working, allow whatever Gary Stiller was building toward to arrive on Gary Stiller's timeline with Gary Stiller's terms. Calvin had spent 8 years in the army learning that the worst position in a developing situation was the one where you were waiting for the situation to reach you. You moved toward it, or you got shaped by it. He thought about his mother's question, "I'm asking if you know why." He thought about Imani at 9, going through typography samples. He thought about the font she had chosen, and why she had chosen it, which she had explained with the seriousness of a 9-year-old explaining something she had thought through completely. Because it's clean, and it's not showing off, and it looks like it's going to be there for a long time. He opened the passenger door and got in. He did not look at Gary Stiller immediately. He looked at the dispatch window, which he could see from here, the light inside, Roz's silhouette at the board, everything running. He looked at his 12 trucks in rows 3 and 7, dark green in the orange yard light. He looked at his phone. He climbed in the passenger side, which was unlocked. He looked at Gary Stiller, whose head was tilted against the window, whose eyes were closed. whose breathing was slow and even. He noted that Gary Stiller breathed at 18 breaths per minute when awake, a count he had established from 3 years of in-person meetings, and that the current breath rate was 14, which was consistent with light sleep, but also with deliberate breath control. He noted that the access panel on the center console was fractionally ajar, in the way it would be if a recording device had recently been placed or adjusted. He looked at his phone. He thought about Desmond, who had called that afternoon with an update on the Meridian acquisition offer. $4.2 million, which was a reasonable number for what RW was worth in the current moment, and an insulting number for what RW would be worth in 3 years. And Calvin had told Desmond to counter at a number that would make Meridian's acquisition team call Gary Stiller directly. He thought about Imani, who would be at his apartment on Saturday, who would ask how the week had been and would listen with her full attention and then say the thing nobody else in the room had said. He thought about his mother, whose name was on 12 trucks 40 feet away in the dark. He thought about the question she had asked. "I'm asking if you know why." He knew why. He had known since the second week of watching the Kenworth park in different corners of the yard, since he had understood that what Gary Stiller was doing was not due diligence, but something closer to fear. The fear of a man who has spent decades accumulating and cannot stop, even when what he is trying to accumulate has decided it does not want to be accumulated. Calvin recognized this not as an indictment of Gary Stiller, but as information about the negotiation. A man acting from fear is not thinking about the other person's interests. He is thinking about his own, which meant that whatever Gary had been building toward tonight, whatever the recording device in the center console was supposed to capture, it was not going to change the fundamental terms of a deal that Calvin had already decided he did not want. He thought about what his mother's inheritance had been worth, and what he had made it worth, and what it would be worth when Imani was old enough to decide what to do with it herself. He thought about the army, where he had learned that the quality of a decision was not measured by whether it felt safe, but by whether it was sound. Making this call from this cab with Gary Stiller's recording device 6 feet away was not the safe option. The safe option was to get out of the truck, go back to the board, let Gary wake up and drive away. Continue the negotiation at Desmond's pace. The safe option was to wait for the situation to arrive at him. He had decided, 8 years ago, in a forward operating base with bad weather and a supply chain held together with judgment and improv, that the safe option was usually the one that gave the situation the most time to get worse. He thought about Roz saying, "The board is what's visible. The operation is also everything the board doesn't show." He thought about what the board did not show right now, that the man 6 feet away had been wrong for 32 nights about what he was looking for, and that he was about to discover this at a time and in a manner that Calvin had chosen, not him. He dialed. Desmond picked up on the second ring. "It's Calvin." "I know it's Calvin. It's 2:15 in the morning. I need you to pull the counter and send termination of negotiation to Meridian's counsel." Tonight, a pause. Desmond was fully awake now. Calvin could hear it in the quality of the silence. "Calvin, we're 4 days from a response deadline. We have a counter they haven't answered." "What changed?" "I'll explain in the morning." "Send it tonight." Is everything all right?" Calvin looked at Gary Stiller. Gary Stiller was breathing at 14 per minute. The yard lights came through the window in orange bars across his face. "Everything is fine," Calvin said. "Send it." "Sent," Desmond said, which was why Calvin paid Desmond what he paid him. Calvin put the phone down on his knee. He looked out the windshield at the yard, his trucks staged in rows 3 and 7 under RW livery, 3 months into a sublease arrangement he had negotiated with the yard manager before anyone at Meridian Corporate had known to ask. The trucks were a dark green that in the yard lights looked almost black. 12 of them. His mother's name on the door of each one, in the font Imani had chosen when she was 9. In the driver's seat, Gary Stiller opened his eyes. He did not move immediately. He looked at the cab ceiling first, for a full 3 seconds, the way a man looks when he's discovering that a plan has not gone the way he intended. Then he turned his head and looked at Calvin, and what was on his face was a man recalculating. Calvin waited. "Reese," Gary said. "Mr. Stiller, you knew I was awake." Calvin answered it anyway. "You've been parking here 2 nights a week for a month. You breathe differently when you're asleep." Gary looked at him for a moment. I was going to catch you making a call you shouldn't be making. I know, I had security concerns. About inventory. There's been a pattern, Mr. Stiller. Calvin said it the way he said most things. Without volume, without heat, with the precision of someone who has decided exactly what the sentence requires. I've worked here 4 years and 7 months. I have not taken anything that wasn't mine. If you have a documented inventory concern, I'd like to see the documentation. Gary was quiet. And if you don't, Calvin said, then I think we both know this was something else. The yard was very still. A truck engine ran on the far side of the lot, a low diesel rumble that did not get closer or farther away. Calvin looked at his 12 trucks in the dark. That call, Gary said. Who were you talking to? My attorney. The recognition arrived in Gary Stiller's face the way things arrive when a man has been moving toward information for a month and it finally gets to him before he gets to it. Your attorney. We were terminating a business negotiation. Tonight felt like the right time. Gary looked at the green trucks in the rows. He looked at the font on the doors, too far away to read in the dark, but he had been in this yard enough nights to have looked at those doors before. He looked at Calvin. RW Freight, Gary said. RW Freight. Gary turned and looked out the windshield. The diesel truck somewhere in the yard went quiet. He was a man who had built something real and could recognize when he was sitting across from someone else who had done the same thing. That recognition did not make him comfortable. How long have you worked for me while owning the company I was trying to acquire? 11 months. And you didn't think that was something you should disclose? My employment file says I own an LLC. You didn't ask what it did. I didn't volunteer it. Calvin looked at him directly. That's not concealment, Mr. Stiller. That's a conversation nobody had. Gary was quiet. He looked at the trucks. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. He was doing a recalculation that Calvin recognized. The recalculation of a situation you thought you were managing and have discovered you were inside of. 4.2 was a fair offer, Gary said. 4.2 was a reasonable offer for what RW is today. It wasn't a fair offer for what RW will be in 3 years. You don't know what RW will be in 3 years. No, but I know what my dispatch board looks like every night. And I know what Meridian's operational gaps look like from the inside. And I know what my contracts are worth and who else is interested in them. He put the phone in his shirt pocket. I know enough. Gary looked at him. The expression of a man who had spent 30 years being the one in the room who knew the most. Sitting across from someone who did not find that arrangement inconvenient. You're walking away from $4.2 million. I walked away 20 minutes ago. There is a specific kind of respect that a person who has built something can only give to another person who has built something. It cannot be performed or manufactured. It arrives, or it doesn't. Gary turned back to the windshield. He was quiet for a long time. In the yard, Calvin's trucks sat in their rows. His mother's name in Imani's font on each door, unreadable in the dark. There, what do you want? Gary said, finally, for Meridian, for RW. If not, 4.2. Calvin looked at the trucks. He thought about his mother and her great-uncle's inheritance and 11 years of overnight shifts and the custody arrangement that had shaped every decision about how to build the operation and what to build it toward. He thought about Imani at 9, going through typography samples with the seriousness of someone for whom this mattered. He thought about what he wanted her to see when she looked at what he had made, not now but when she was older and the looking would count for more. I want a partnership, Calvin said, not an acquisition. RW stays RW. Independent management, my name on the contracts, my trucks under my livery. Meridian gets preferred rates on regional routes and first right of refusal on overflow capacity. We grow together, or we don't. That's not how acquisitions work. No, it's not. The yard was completely still. Gary Stiller appeared to be doing a calculation about something that had not been in his original plan and was now unavoidable. Let your lawyer know that Meridian's counsel will be in touch, Gary said. Calvin opened the passenger door. The night air came in cold and diesel-scented. He stepped down from the cab and closed the door and stood for a moment in the yard. In the orange light, 12 green trucks at rows 3 and 7, his shift still running. He went back to the dispatch desk. Roz was at the secondary board when he came in. She looked at him when he sat down. He looked at the board. Truck 14 is running late on the Henderson run. Can you get them on radio? She got them on radio. He worked the board. He had 4 hours left on his shift, and he worked all of them. At 6 in the morning, the day shift came on. He drove home, showered, made Imani's lunch for Saturday, and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked out the window at the street coming light. He thought about $4.2 million, which he had walked away from, which was the right decision, which he would not stop being certain of and would not stop thinking about. Because both things were true simultaneously, and that was what decisions cost. His phone rang. Desmond, Meridian's counsel, called me at 7 a.m. Gary Stiller wants to schedule a meeting, partnership structure. A pause. Calvin, what happened in that yard? The CEO was asleep in his truck. Was he? He was not, as it turned out, asleep, a silence that contained, Calvin estimated, 6 years of professional restraint. And the termination notice? Let it stand. Let them ask for the meeting. Let them ask twice. Then we talk. He hung up and drank his coffee and thought about his mother, whose name was on 12 trucks. He thought about Imani, who would be here Saturday with her homework and her one question and her habit of seeing the thing in a room that everyone else had decided not to say. He thought about what he would tell her when she asked how the week had been. Imani came on Saturday. She dropped her bag at the door and opened the refrigerator and looked inside with the assessing attention she brought to most things. Then she came and sat across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him. Dad, yeah, something happened. It was not a question. He had learned to maintain a neutral expression in most conditions. And she had known since she was approximately 6 that the neutral expression was information. Something happened, he said. She waited. That was her father's gift back to her, the patience to wait for the right moment. He told her the parts she could understand, the trucks, the offer, the man asleep in the cab, the phone call, the termination notice at 2 in the morning. He told her about the partnership terms. He told her the other man had said his lawyers would be in touch, which in this context meant yes. Imani listened with her full attention. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone arriving at the one thing. Does it mean we keep the trucks? She asked. Yes, and your name stays on the contracts. Yes. She nodded slowly. Good, she said, with a finality that closed the subject. Then, can we make something for lunch? He got up and they made lunch, sandwiches, her preference, and he thought, while he made them, about what it meant to build something you could show your daughter, not as an object lesson, but as a fact. This is here. I made this. It has your grandmother's name on it. The things built in the dark, without an audience, without certainty, for reasons that cannot be fully explained at the time, those are the things that hold. Not because they were built perfectly, but because they were built toward something true.